The Chamoli incursion bid by the Chinese has been there for all to see. Amidst reports that there are developments in the South China Sea, the Chinese sources say are gearing up for a better and spruced up combat capability. We catch up with senior foreign affairs expert Commander Uday Bhaskar to get a perspective on the Indo-China story. Uday Bhaskar calls it a complex genealogy.
54 years after the October 1962 war, India and China do not have an agreed border, meaning that this is an unresolved territorial dispute that has a very complex genealogy. So, to that extent, what we have just witnessed, you can see that despite the media reports which spoke about quote unquote incursion by Chinese troops, this kind of a pattern was seen in the past. It's quite likely that it may occur again. And I think we need to keep this in mind that depending on the texture of the bilateral relationship,
Taking a cue from the NSJ bid of India, which recently failed to make much headway, Uday Bhaskar, who has been closely watching things, says Pakistan's hand in the Indo-China tussle cannot be denied. The claim comes as Defence Minister Manohar Parrikar said it was a transgression, not incursion, in Uttarakhand, adding that there was a well-defined mechanism to settle such transgressions.
dramatic of them all was when President Xi Jinping was in India and he was being received by Prime Minister Modi in Ahmedabad. We had a report of PLA troops, quote unquote, making an incursion into India. So I think it is this kind of a pattern that is likely to manifest itself again, and it calls for very, I would say, astute and careful political handling of the situation, which, to their credit, both Beijing and New Delhi have been able to bring to the table. But this is not a satisfactory situation. India and China need to resolve the unresolved territorial dispute, but let us not forget that there is a whole Pakistan dimension in this, meaning that there is one part which has been ceded by Pakistan to China, which India maintains is illegal. Now, all of this adds to the complexity. So, I think India and China need to sit down at some point and decide how and when they will arrive at what has been referred to as the mutual understanding and the mutual accommodation of each other's positions. Well, again, I'll say that the China India relationship is perhaps India's most critical and most important relationship. It's complex, it's contradictory, it has many facets to it. As I said, we have an unresolved territorial dispute, therefore, there is no border. China continues to provide weapons of mass destruction support to Pakistan, which in turn supports terrorism against India. So, indirectly, China also has a role to play as far as India's low intensity conflict and terrorism related challenge is concerned. But then the contradictory part is that China is also India's largest trading partner and will become even more important as their economy grows and that of India grows. So I think all these are some of the characteristics that define this very complex bilateral relationship. Could India have done better? I think the answer is always yes, meaning that if you review the foreign policy or a security policy of a country,
Uttarakhand Chief Minister Harish Rawat had confirmed incursion by Chinese troops into Chamoli district. Uttarakhand notably shares a 350-kilometer long boundary with China. Attempts of incursions by China are nothing new.
in time, I think my own response as an analyst is that India should focus on enhancing its comprehensive national power.
While the Jhula diplomacy of PM Modi and President Xi Jinping in Ahmedabad is still fresh in memory, Jinping is pushing China's 2.3 million strong PLA to train hard to win wars as it expands its high-tech arsenal.
I think it's very important for us to get a political consensus in India about how do we deal with China. Unfortunately, if you look at the way in which the opposition parties repeatedly take the government to task, and this pattern has been followed for the last 10-15 years that I can remember. We need a very clear and objective political consensus about how do we deal with China. For that matter, Pakistan also, I would say every major national security issue. And the third is integrity. Sometimes it appears that there is a lack of institutional integrity when we deal with our neighbors. And I think that's a very big omission which needs to be redressed at the earliest. This is something that the Southeast Asian nations are trying very hard to deal with unsuccessfully. And at this point, I do not believe that the United States wants to be drawn into this South China Sea dispute. So, as a result, I think China will be able to get away with its very assertive behavior. Now, to me, as an analyst, again, I think there is a correlation between China in its South China Sea dispute with how it is likely to behave as far as India and the unresolved territorial dispute are concerned. Ever since we had the visit of then President Jiang Zemin and Prime Minister Narasimha Rao was the Indian leader, they signed an agreement in 1993. And I think it must be repeated that 23 years down the road, not a shot has been fired in anger by either military. And this despite the fact that both countries have a fairly visible military deployment and presence along what is called as the line of actual control. And most recently, India has also deployed tanks closer to certain Chinese positions. Now, all of this would suggest that the situation is very tense, but I repeat this point. I think the political and diplomatic handling has been satisfactory till now. We hope it remains that way and there is no war. It may be recalled that when we carried out the test in May of 1998 under the stewardship of Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, he wrote a letter to then US President Bill Clinton and actually said that India is very concerned about China. And that's part of the reason why India had to acquire nuclear weapons. Again, Beijing was not very happy with India's candor. So I'm saying there is a background to the way in which India perceives China, and in turn how China perceives India as far as the nuclear issue is concerned. And I think this time, again, it's my reading as an analyst, that perhaps India could have handled the NSG issue differently and not elevated it to the level of the Prime Minister and President.